of the demise of Christianity are often, always, greatly exaggerated. I don't know what we might say about the European Union, but we shall see. The way in which I'm going to approach this topic will be different, of course, from the other speakers, I expect, and it may even be different from how you expect things to turn out this afternoon. But just bear with me as I develop my argument. And I think the first thing that struck me when I was invited to speak here was that when appeals are made to European civilization, as they often are in promoting the European Union, indeed the Church of England itself was doing precisely that at the time that Stuart was mentioning, these appeals are to a great extent anachronistic because, of course, the civilization to which they appeal, classical civilization, was not limited to the northwest end of the Eurasian Peninsula. Classical civilization, as you know, was spread over 3 continents. What we now call Europe, of course, Southwestern Asia, and Northern Africa. And this is worth remembering because I think it has relevance for how we should see the future of Europe. And George Weigel, in his book, develops this argument very well. So there is an anachronism. I mean, Europa, the legend of Europa itself was the kidnapping of the daughter of a king in what is now Lebanon, Tyre, the king of Tyre, by Zeus, and her seduction in Crete. So you already have this connection, as it were, amongst Mediterranean lands, east and west. But this anachronism, if you like, of restricting European civilization to one corner, as it were, of the ancient world, this is complemented, I suppose is the word, with arrival. The arrival of ideas in well, southern Europe certainly, but what we now call Europe, and particularly moral and spiritual ideas and practices. So Bishop Lightfoot, in his excellent excursus on the relationship between St. Paul and Seneca, points out that the moral fervor, certainly the moral fervor of the Stoics, was due to the Oriental influence and indeed origin of many Stoic ideas. This reminded me of the assertion sometimes made by the Church Fathers that, perhaps exaggerated, but with certainly a germ of truth in them, that many of the moral ideas of the Greek thinkers actually had their origin in Moses. They were a borrowing from Moses, therefore, from the Bible. If we are talking about arrivals, then the arrival of an itinerant preacher from Troy, well, coming from Troy, he was from much further east, of course, but he left from Troy to arrive in Philippi, in Macedonia, is of crucial importance to the history of Europe. And of course, by that I mean the arrival of St. Paul. Pope Benedict called this a turning point, not only in European history, but in world history, because it changed everything forever. And it is the obstinate refusal of the architects of the European Union to recognize and to accommodate this fact that has struck me as very odd in itself. But these arrivals, culminating in the arrival of Christianity in Europe, this cross-fertilization of Jerusalem with Athens, with the developing by Christianity of what Benedict also called purified Hellenism. Purified Hellenism. As I say, responsible for so many incredible moral and spiritual changes on the map of what we now call Europe. I mean, one of the first things that Christianity did was to challenge the widespread practice of usually female infanticide. You see, the killing of unwanted children. Well, that's still going on under another name, as we all know, of course. And you may remember 18 months ago there was an article in the journal, in a medical journal here in this country, describing something called post-birth abortion. Well, that is what Christians were against. How quickly slavery came to an end in this country and also elsewhere in Europe after the arrival of Christianity. I mean, Anselm declared it unchristian, Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course the ending of the games. You know, we are becoming once again a bread and circuses culture, aren't we? We can't survive without some games going on somewhere at some time. But the ending of the games was the ending of a feature of Roman civilization particularly, which took pleasure in cruelty. So these arrivals were hugely significant in shaping what was to become Western civilization. But there was, of course, an immediate assault. No sooner had Christian ideas begun to take root and to change culture, to change values, there was the eruption, as you know, of the barbarian invasions, arising in those parts of what we now call Europe that had not really come under the influence of either Roman or Greek civilization. The eruption, as it were, of the Germanic tribes and the destruction in the west of the Roman Empire. Now, this could have been the end of any European project whatsoever, actually, if it had not been for Christianity. Of course, the Eastern Roman Empire survived for several centuries until it was overtaken by Islam. That's another story, perhaps a relevant story for us today. But in the West, certainly, it was the Christian church and the Christian faith that made it possible for civilization to survive at all after these great eruptions that took place. And the point that I would want to make this afternoon is that the contribution that Christianity made was different in different places with different peoples. It was not monolithic. For instance, there was, first of all, perhaps paralleling what is happening with the European Union, the emergence of what came to be called the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne, the way in which he organized his people, how he extended his territory, so that eventually Leo III had to recognize him in some way, and he was given the title of Holy Roman Emperor. This was an attempt to restore in the West some notion of a unified civilization. Charlemagne, of course, was very interested in the Christian aspect of this and made very sure that Christian moral and spiritual ideas inform the emergence and the development of his empire. I mean, the merits and demerits of that perhaps we can go into later on, but this was one way in which the rebuilding, as it were, began to take place. But the other was the emergence in places like Italy and Switzerland of city-states. You know, not the monolith of the empire, as it were, not Christianity imitating the Roman Empire. Who was it who said of the Holy Roman Empire that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire? Who was it?
Voltaire.
Was it Voltaire? Oh, I would expect Voltaire to say that kind of thing. But the city-states were quite different. I mean, one of the catalysts in the emergence of the city-states, it seems, was the presence of a bishop in them. I mean, bishops had their uses. But I expected that it was not just the individual, bishop as an individual, but as representing an institution that promoted literacy, music, building, other civilizational values. But then the third is the unique instance of England. So England, at first anyway, perhaps until Henry VIII, did not develop as an empire, in the sense of the Holy Roman Empire, nor as a collection of city-states, but from the very beginning had a quite centralized understanding of itself. And the reason for this, well, there are a number of people who are the reason for this. Two individuals who both came from outside, actually, who provided for something of the unification of the English people. I mean, if you read Bede's history, which is a history of the people, not just of the church, the two he identifies are Hadrian the African and Theodore, Archbishop of Canterbury, who of course also came, funnily enough, from Tarsus. So another arrival, as it were, like St. Paul. But the unifying of the church, the gathering of the disparate elements of English Christianity by these two, the Synod of Whitby, the creation of the parochial system, the beginnings of the creation of the parochial system, the beginning of provision for education. See, education was for a long time provided by the church and not by the state. I mean, the state is a very late comer to the business of universal education. And so when people ask about church schools, I think the very least we can say is we were here first, by quite a long way. Anyway, this resulted in this sense of unity of the English people, of the development of forms of government, and an identity, I suppose, one has to say. So the rebuilding inspired by Christianity was not monolithic, that's one of my theses. And then, wherever it took place, it seems to me that there were two poles to it. There was what you might call the top-down rebuilding. I don't know if you can build from the top down, but this did happen. Which had to do with society being organized according to Christian ideas. So the Christian doctrine of God, the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, was hugely influential in this, because here there is both order and mutuality. You see, the Son is not the Father. The Holy Spirit is neither the Father nor the Son. So there is order in the Blessed Trinity, but also a mutuality. The Son loves the Father loves the Son. The Holy Spirit, as Augustine said, is the relationship of love amongst them, between them. And this brought about a society which was based of course, on divine law, come to that in a moment, but also a recognition of natural law and of human positive law, but which reflected both order and interdependence. Mutual obligation was recognized, in other words. It was not a society where people stood on their rights, but where they recognized their obligation to their neighbor. Now, of course, people misused this sense of interdependence and of order for their own interests. I do not in any way deny that, but simply to recognize it. Secondly, it was a society that took seriously the importance of the Ten Commandments. I've been doing a study of the Ten Commandments, actually, for some teaching purposes later on. And it was Alfred, I think, in this case, King Alfred, who, when he was devising the common law, what came to be known as the common law tradition, made sure that the different elements of the laws of the different peoples in his kingdom, when they were being synthesized into this common law, were always consonant with the teaching of the Bible, and particularly of the devil. Now, in America, as you may know, people are busily removing the Decalogue from courtrooms. Well, you can do that, but you cannot remove the basis for law as it came to be of the common law tradition. You can't remove that. You can't deny, but people can deny history, but I think they're very unwise to do so. And then the third main idea in this top-down building, if you like, of polity in Europe was the idea of the godly ruler. That the ruler is as much accountable for what he or she does as anyone else. And this continues to be reflected in our coronation service, where almost one of the first promises that the monarch has to make is to promote obedience of the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel. You see that? I mean, if you're looking for a basis of the constitution in this country, that's quite a good place to begin. So there was the top-down movement, but there was also a bottom-up movement. And it is here that we encounter again and again the expression made in God's image. So the idea of the fundamental dignity of the human person, the freedom, limited but nevertheless real, of the human person, the power of agency, all of this had to do with being made in God's image. From this came two things that became very important, remain very important today. The first was the importance of conscience. That if this person is really free, then conscience becomes very important, because how you act makes a difference in the world around you, to yourself, and to other people. And the other idea was that of consent. That however God-given and providential the political and social order might be, it is not legitimate until it has the consent of those who are governed. I mean, again, as you can see, this is a fundamental idea in the civilization that was to emerge. Interestingly enough, it had another life, if you like, across the ocean. Because when Europeans began to arrive in the Americas, the question arose about the status of the indigenous people. And there were, of course, many people then who were quite content to deny any status to the indigenous people. That helped them in the removal of those people, in taking their lands and using them in forced labor and all of those things that undoubtedly happened. against this stood out many Christian leaders. I have in mind Bishop in Mexico, Bishop Bartolome Las Casas, who said no, this cannot be done because these people are also made in God's image. Therefore, they also have rights to property. They also have family rights and obligations. They have a right to earn their living. They have the right to mobility and so on. This debate got back to Europe through the Dominican University of Salamanca and the work of people like Francisco Vittoria, against those who believe not in natural freedom but in natural slavery, following Aristotle. You see, I mean, Greek democracy is not all it's trumpeted to be, and it would be very unsafe for us to base ourselves on it. It was very selective, very exclusive, and very often degenerated into oligarchy. The point is that this discussion, which was really a Dominican discussion for a long time, was picked up by some of the moderate Enlightenment. And I think we must distinguish between the moderate and the radical Enlightenment. Sorry, I had a glass of water here. What did I do? You can bring me my water. Thank you. Well, I have to bring your Newton, Locke, Boyle, these to me represent the moderate Enlightenment, which was an attempt to bring Christian thinking to bear on a new scientific and social situation. The radical Enlightenment is quite different. I'll come to it in a moment. But if you read John Locke, he also, almost word for word, refers to some of the things that Las Casas and Vittoria were talking about. And again, explicitly, like them, refers to the image of God. This is also the case in legislation today. I mean, sometimes when we are looking at liminal issues that are touching on human dignity, on the sacredness of the human person, things like that, we have to appeal to transcendent principles. Utilitarianism fails us at that time. So do opinion, or should do. So do opinion polls and all that kind of. Now, natural rights talk, which is mutated into human rights talk. Of course, there are very unreasonable aspects to it as it is developed in the European Union, as you and I know. But any kind of talk about the inherent dignity of the human person can only be justified by reference to its Christian origins, its transcendent origins, not otherwise. Now, this rebuilding, of course, was also accompanied, as you know, by a great renewal of learning, of art, of literature, of law. I mean, people talk about the influence of Roman law in the development of law in Europe and even in parts of this country. But the point to make is that the Roman law that contributed to this legal development was not just classical Roman law. It was actually Roman law as mediated to us by Christians. It was Justinian and Theodosius. It was not without that Christian refraction, if you like. And then there was Reformation. I think we have to acknowledge that the insistence amongst the reformers that the Word of God should be made available to ordinary people. Whatever its religious effects might be, it was one of the reasons for the spread of literacy. for instance, not just the spread of literacy, but the virtual creation of languages like English. And I sometimes say that Shakespeare is unthinkable without Tyndale. And the way in which the English language was formed and developed because of the translation of the Bible and its widespread use among people, becoming part, therefore, of ordinary discourse. Now, I've talked about the moderate Enlightenment. Many of these achievements of this recreation, of this renewal, of this rebuilding, were strongly challenged by what you might call the radical Enlightenment. If the moderate Enlightenment drew on Christian principles, here was something different. And we have to ask whether these European projects that Stuart was mentioning, to what extent are they influenced by this moderate Christian Enlightenment and to what extent by the radical. It seems to me one way of reading history, certainly after the Second World War, is to see a move away from the moderate to the radical Enlightenment. And that may be part of our problem. Many things can be said about the radical Enlightenment, some of them not very polite, I shan't say them. But just to think, I mean, you have first of all Rousseau's idea of the noble savage against the Christian idea, first of all, of the creation of human beings as a community. You see, when they're created in God's image, man and woman He made. Together He made them. Together they are given their common mission. So it is not, there's no primal horde of Darwin's, and there is no noble savage. What you have from the very beginning is human society. But then also, talking about the nobility bit of it, the Bible also recognizes the fallenness. Not just the image of God, but that this image has become tarnished, it has become obscured, it has been damaged, not destroyed, but certainly all of those things. And what did William Golding say? That he thought of human beings as permeated by darkness, but somehow, even in that darkness, there is an emerging light, that redeeming light, if you like. What makes it possible for us to be good and not radically evil. So the noble savage idea stands against a Christian anthropology, if you like. Feuerbach saying that all theology was anthropology, that the proper study of man is man. And against this, the Christian idea that man cannot be understood without reference to God. That in fact all anthropology, all genuine anthropology is theology. Otherwise you have absurdity, irrationality, a rational observing being in an irrational, directionless and purposeless universe. And what sense does that make to anyone? The third idea, of course, is Marx's. And my original objection to Marx was not his economic theories, but his historical determinism. You see, the basic denial in Marx of human freedom. And also, of course, his materialism. Christianity stands both for the priority of the mind and the spirit and for human freedom against Marx. And then the fourth idea, belated perhaps, is the Freudian and Jungian interest, let us say obsession, with the self. With the self and with the autonomy of the self, if you like. Christianity has always emphasized the interdependence of human beings. But it is this obsession, therapeutic if you like, which is leading to the kind of narcissism that we find all around us. I was interested to read that 70% of all the pictures taken on mobile telephones are of ourselves. Selfies, that's it, yeah, that's what they're called. Selfies. 70% of them. Well, that's a very nice picture of narcissism. Those who began with the reconstruction of Europe were, some of them anyway, were people with a Christian vision. And, well, I mean, you know the names, Robert Schumann, Jean Monnet, even Konrad Adenauer. And their instinct was to recover the historical and cultural commonality that there is because of this incredible influence of the Christian faith, even in mediating the classical tradition to us. They were also concerned that Europe should not again, never again, be embroiled in the kind of bloody wars in which it had been in the first half of the 20th century. And they were concerned, of course, also for economic prosperity, for the rebuilding, the reconstruction of Europe, and so forth. This is very far from the kind of super-state project into which it has mutated. So I'm sure the other speakers will also say this. There are things about the European idea that we should affirm. That there's nothing wrong with them. Living at peace with our neighbors, cooperating economically with our neighbors, celebrating a common culture and the achievements of that culture. There's nothing wrong with it. But that is not a super-state. And the super-state idea is, I think, informed not by the moderate Enlightenment, not by Christianity, but by the radical Enlightenment. And that is why it is resulting in certain dangers with which you are no doubt familiar, but I just want quickly to pinpoint what they are. There is, first of all, the growth of this overweening bureaucracy, which seems not to be accountable to anyone. This goes against the Christian idea of the godly ruler, who is accountable to a moral law, who is accountable to other people, and of course who is accountable to God. This bureaucracy seems to be unaccountable on every side, on every front. It is not just that there is a bureaucracy, but there is an emerging bondage, if you like, a totalitarianism that is being given birth. Again and again we see a restriction, not just of practices, but of ideas. So the Italian minister who was denied confirmation as a commissioner of the European Union, was denied confirmation not because of something he had done or even that he said he would do, but simply because of what he thought. Similarly, hate speech laws. This book called Censored by Robert Coleman is an account of how hate speech laws are restricting freedom more and more for people. So the question here is not whether at the European level or derivatively at the state level, whether what someone has said has incited people to violence or even to discrimination. That's not the question. The question is simply that they have said those things. I mean, where will that end? Criticism of other people, not liking their views, not liking their religion perhaps, or what they wear, etc. I mean, this will create a very real bondage, if you like, for people. More and more the refusal by the European courts and also our domestic courts to recognize conscience. You remember how the emergence of conscience was the result of the emphasis in this development from below of the dignity of the human person. And Britain has had a very long and honourable history of recognizing conscience in law. Conscientious objection during the war. The Abortion Act is not my favourite piece of legislation, but even that recognizes conscience in certain circumstances for medical practitioners. The Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, again, not a favourite, but nevertheless it also recognizes conscience. But recent legislation, equality legislation, for instance, does not make any room for conscience. And this is reflected in the decisions of both domestic courts and the European Court itself. Nor is there recognition of reasonable accommodation at the workplace for people's beliefs. And it is this that has resulted in a spate of removal from employment, dismissals, deregistration from professional bodies, all of those things that you undoubtedly know about. So the bureaucracy is leading to the bondage of totalitarianism. At particular risk, of course, are our children. Because Peter Hitchens has said one of the signs of totalitarianism is when the state starts taking responsibility for our children rather than for the parents to be the primary people responsible for them. And thirdly, this emergence of a super-state of this kind will in the end result in barbarism, because it will destroy the fundamental values that people hold, and it is these values that create culture. Material or intellectual or literary or whatever it may be. This is in fact George Weigel's thesis in this very suggestive book of his called The Cube and the Cathedral, which is a comparison of Notre Dame with the Pompidou Institute, opposite the Louvre, I think it is, where he compares the featurelessness of modern and postmodern architecture with the glorious asymmetry of our cathedrals, which have been born out of a spiritual vision. And the point that he makes is that without a spiritual and moral vision, great culture, high culture is not possible. Now, to finish, what can we do in these circumstances? I think the first thing is that we must at all costs resist the emergence of a superstate. Particularly, I think, where England is concerned, which has a long history of a completely different kind of development as a state. Quite different from the rest of Europe, even from the city-states, certainly from the model of the Holy Roman Empire, such as it was. Secondly, we must make sure that our laws continue to provide for a recognition of conscience and of reasonable accommodation. Without this, the superstate will make sure that even the sort of thing that I'm saying at the moment will become more and more difficult, if not impossible, to say. There have been instances of this in the last year in my own experience, where, for instance, Oxbridge colleges and big conference centres in London will not host a conference on marriage if it is the traditional Christian view of marriage. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that we are facing. And thirdly, and finally, preachers are allowed. Finally as well. At the very end, I think it is important to say that the Judeo-Christian tradition is more important for this country than any one church. When I argue for the public importance of the Judeo-Christian tradition in policy making, in legislation, I am not talking about the privilege of this or that church. I mean, that is a separate argument. But without that, we are left with opinion polls. We are left with a kind of naive consequentialism that will not in the end respect the human person, particularly when the human person is weakest. At the earlier stages of life, at the later stages of life, and even when for some reason or the other we find ourselves in a situation where our natural faculties may be greatly weakened through disease. The Liverpool Care Pathway events should show us that we cannot trust utilitarianism to respect the human person. I hope that lesson has been learned. Thank you very much for your attention.